Hello everyone. Welcome to the debrief of round two in the motion of sports. This house prefers competitive sports with a stoicism. So in this debrief, I'm going to explain a few things that you could bring in both sides of the house. So there are basically three things and three area that you could explore in this type of motion and specifically in this motion. So firstly, on the contention to talk about athletes' well-being. So in government side of the house, you could explain things like um, sports with stoicism harms the athlete well-being. This is the case due to the fact that you're expected to push through during practices and competition in the midst of burnout. This is taxing mentally to the athletes because of three reasons. Number one, it's because practicing in nature requires you to face failures and criticism, be it from your coaches, fellow athletes, and etc. This creates a mental harm because you feel not good enough as an individual, especially during mental exhaustion. So your capacity to rationalize criticism and failure in this practice or like when you're practicing is minimal due to the negative thoughts and exhaustion that overclouds your rationality. So basically, this explains things like why then when they're expected to go to practices, they're less likely to, especially during mental exhaustion, they're less likely to have rational capacity to like absorb those criticism and absorbs failures. While in normal situation, you would think that this is normal, but when you have mental exhaustion, there's this negative thoughts that internalize everything that happens in your life to become a negative thing in general. But the second reason is during competition, it's inevitable to get bad scores, especially when athletes are not in their prime. Facing these failures will be exceptionally hard that also causes mental harm in the process. The third and last reason is that the athletes do not have the option to opt out if they're feeling unwell due to the expectation of tenacity and perseverance created by this stoicism. So therefore, they will certainly face the harm mentioned above. So the last reason, proves that this is likely for the harm to occur because the mitigating factor to that, to opt out from that, is not necessarily visible because if they opt out, either they would get backlash, either they would get criticism and whatnot. So it would exacerbate the mental exhaustion, and therefore the calculus of the athletes would most probably still push through and whatnot, especially there is an expectation for you to have this perseverance and of itself. The case study that you could use to explain this is the case of Simone Biles in Tokyo Olympics 2021 when she pulled out from both the team final and the women's individual all around at the Tokyo Games to focus on her mental health issues despite her participation being already registered. Her withdrawal, in fact, has generated a lot of backlash from domestic US gymnastics supporters. So you could use this case study to explain how then this expectation of stoicism in and of itself part athletes to create and to take care of their mental well-being in the process because the president says and you could explain that the reason as to why this particular backlash happens due to stoicism existing and whatnot. So that's the first thing that you could explain in golf to talk about athletes' well-being in your comparative. And on comparative, we posit that OP can explain things like sports with stoicism does not create harm to the athlete's well-being due to the fact that the expectation to be achieving is something that is attainable. So basically, the way that you frame GOP's contention upon the idea of athletes unable to be, uh, the athletes having mental harm and whatnot, the way that you should reframe it is by saying whether the expectation is something that is attainable. It's not necessarily burdening the athlete. This is true because of two reasons. Number one, it's because that in competition and practices, it's normal. It's a normal thing to lose, even when there are criticism. You can always have the avenue to defend yourself, like giving clarification, blaming externalities. For instance, as you could say that, oh, the reason why I lose right now is not necessarily because of my fault and whatnot. It's because of the strategic mistake that we made as the team as a whole, or like because of the condition of the field that is not necessarily good or like bad condition of the field, blaming the the event holder or whatnot, or like you could just say that the opponent is just too strong on this kind of thing. So basically, that criticism that might potentially protects you mentally does not necessarily oftenly occurs due to the fact that you have this avenue to protect yourself. But second of all, especially in competitive sports, the athletes are professional. That means that they already have a skill set for them to attain success irrespective of their condition. That is to say that even when you're not focused due to mental exhaustion, there is still muscle memory that can execute the movement strategy and whatnot. So this type of explanation could be framed in a way that says that even if failure could exist on our side of the house, it would not be significant because you would do as you usually do, but not necessarily that prime, but not necessarily better when you're at prime and whatnot. So those two reasons prove why then this expectation is something that is okay and attainable and accessible for the athletes. But you could also propose that it would be worse off than in government due to the fact that resting wouldn't actually help the well-being of the athletes. That's to say that you could explain that in the context of competitive sports, you're always going to be exposed to your fellow athletes excelling in their fields, breaking records, winning competition, collecting more trophies and whatnot. So it means that resting would result in self-blaming to the athletes that they're not doing hard enough. This happened because the reason why they do self-blame is not because of the expectation from Stoicism, but due to the competitive nature of sports that exists on both sides of the house. So to force them to rest is counterproductive to the mental well-being instead, as opposed to giving them an avenue to resting, an avenue to reflecting on their mistakes and whatnot to have a better process of recovery. So that's the first layer of athletes' well-being that you posit both in golf and op. The second layer, though, that you can posit about the comparative. What will happen on your side of the house why then it will be better? So in government side of the house, you could say that comparatively with the Stoicism, it means that you were not required to push through. And it's okay to take a break during great mental exhaustion. This is better because of 4 reasons. Number one, it means that you can opt out from practice and competition without being judged by your coaches, fellow athletes, and fans, therefore making more room for you to be able to recover from your mental exhaustion. And therefore, this type of reason, you could frame it, is it about the sustainability of the career? It's about the longevity of the career and whatnot. This type of reason could be framed that way. But second reason is that you're less likely to get mental harm due to less chances for you to face failures, criticism, and competitive nature of sports due to now you're allowed to rest and take a break. That means that when you're allowed to opt out, more likely for you to avoid mental harm that exists. But third of all, this is good for the well-being of an athlete because it gives avenue for you to have a break, meaning that the athletes can have time to reflect on their struggles without negative influences from the competitive nature of sports or friends or other external parties that could cause this mental harm. So meaning that you have an avenue and a room for you to actually figure out whether you're burnt out or actually resting because you're so tired physically and mentally. But fourthly, this is also better because even when you're required to compete due to things like contracts and etc., you're more likely going to be okay due to the fact that not achieving is something that is fine without Stoicism, because feeling tired of mental exhaustion becomes a legitimate reason for you to lose. So it's far safer for the well-being of the athletes regardless, even if they're forced to compete anyway on our side of the house. On opposition, what you could provide in comparative is that comparatively on our side of the house, when you still push through amidst of mental exhaustion, you feel at ease because you feel like you're trying. So appreciation to self is far likely to exist on our side of the house, resulting in a better recovery process. So at worst, you cannot excel due to mental exhaustion. It's still better on your side of the house because at least that you feel like you're trying, at least that you feel like you're still pushing through and whatnot. This is a far better condition because since the beginning, they're built to compete. They're built to actually excel. And this is not necessarily the expectation from Stoicism, but a general expectation in competition in general. So that therefore they would feel better instead and less likely to have self-blame. In best case though, it's going to be more fulfilling for the athletes due to the fact that overcoming your mental exhaustion and striving through that gives you more fulfillment because you will feel stronger and the achievement would be more fruitful to you. The case study to back this up, you could use the case of Yui Ohashi. In an interview, it was disclosed that she had battled anxiety and depression for the last 5 years that contributed to her failure to make it to Rio Olympics in 2016. In fact, she has lost multiple national and international swimming tournaments between 2016 and 2019 that almost led her to give up on her swimming career. In the end, though, she managed to win 2 gold medals in Tokyo Olympics. So this basically proving that in the midst of mental exhaustion, in the midst of you facing a lot of failures and whatnot, striving through that will lead to like a more fruitful fulfillment for you because you would feel like your hard work and whatnot will be something that is, worth it, right? So it paid off, basically. So that's the second layer and second contention that you bring on the contention of athletes' well-being. So yeah, that's on athletes' well-being. The second area they could explore, though, is to talk about the enjoyment of sports. So in this area, in government style house, you could explain things like sports with stoicism will reduce the enjoyment of sports. So basically, you could argue that expectation to break through barriers like human physical capacity and etc. is a very masculine-centric idea. Therefore, this type of things is not it's exactly not enjoyable for the general public. This is why most viewers of sports are masculine individuals, because the excitement from things like fighting under the last drop of your blood and etc. are viewed as violent or barbaric, and etc. by the general public. Exactly on our side of the house, we will redefine competitive sports to be more accommodative to the general audiences. It is because on our side of the house, we will be glorifying the idea of sportsmanship, mental and physical well-being, and the persona of this particular athletes being, therefore, sports becomes more humanized to the general public. So more likely they would enjoy this further on our side of the house. When this is important, the way that you could frame it is that one, you could say that exactly the entertainment will be bigger on our side of the house because it penetrates to a larger audience as opposed to a niche audience that predominantly included in predominantly filled by masculine male. Or B, you could also explain as a consequence of that, it means that you will have a bigger viewership on our side of the house due to the competitive sports becoming much more accessible to the general public. And lastly, this impacts not only to teams because they will get more revenue through TV deals, ticket sales, merchandise, and etc., but also to athletes who will have better play, more chances to take sponsorship of different brands because of bigger viewership. On the opposition, though, you could also explain and argue sports without stoicism would reduce the enjoyment of sports due to, one, the athletes will have less incentive to push through and exceed their limits due to the narrative that say that it's okay to take break when you have mental exhaustion. This means that less likely there will be an engaging game in competitive sports because athletes and teams are less likely to fight until the last drop of their blood. But second, athletes would be less likely to use strategy that is risky, that exceeds human capacity, due to this type of things is likely to exhaust you mentally. Therefore, when you're allowed to restrain yourself, more likely you're going to opt into that because that's just seem easier and less of a hassle. This means that the game would look monotone and not enjoyable to the people because there's less incentive for the athlete to push through and to break through the barriers of human capacity, which is enjoyable to the general public. But thirdly, the comparative on our side of the house is that you're going to force athletes to force athletes to their limit, hence creating a more enjoyable game. Whether the enjoyment of sports is important, though, the way that you could frame it is that, number one, this is to give the entertainment to the audiences because people like seeing the impossible. This is why when athletes do something that average people cannot do, this excites them in general public. This is why when Usain Bolt, like breaking records and whatnot, and running basically in the speed that average human cannot do, this excites people. Or when Cristiano Ronaldo do like making goals that are average person cannot do or average football player cannot do, this excites general public and whatnot. So basically, this excites people and give more enjoyment. But second, as a consequence of that, it means that when you reduce the excitement, it means that you will reduce the viewership because competitive sports is no longer exciting. So then therefore, less people will watch competitive sports without stoicism and whatnot. But lastly, this impacts not only to teams because they cannot get revenue through TV deals, ticket sales, merchandise, and etc., but also to the athletes who will get pay cut and less chances to get sponsorship due to less viewership and whatnot. So it harms the athlete on their side of the house. So that's the second area that you could explore. The last area that you could explore is to talk about the relation between fans and athlete, right? So in government side of the house, you could argue that competitive sports with stoicism would create a toxic fandom in sports due to two things. A, this happens due to fans feeling entitled to criticize the athlete when they are underperforming. Because stoicism makes the criticism legitimate due to athletes needing to push through regardless of the condition. As a consequence of that, fans were more likely to attack athletes and get less repercussion to that action because there's this narrative that legitimates that action. But second, comparatively on our side of the house, the dynamic between fans and athletes are more healthy due to less entitlement without the existence of stoicism. That means either A, athletes are going to feel less burden in doing their job, but B, they will also create a better environment in sports in general. Therefore, the relation between fans and athlete will be much more less violent, less criticism, and creating much more safe space for the athlete in general. The case study that you could use to this is that the hooliganism that exists in football, be it in English Premier League, etc., like them using racial slurs to attack athletes, direct confrontation with other fandom, etc. You could explore on that to explain this argumentation. In up, though, you could also explain that competitive sports without stoicism result to a non-meaningful relation between fans and athletes. it happens in two prongs. Number one, the experience to push through amidst burnout is not only felt by the athletes, but also the fans. What's unique about this experience is the emotional exchange between the athletes and fans. E.g., when the athletes are facing breakdown, there is an emotional exchange from fans that encourage the athlete to get back up. Or when the athletes are winning, the euphoria is also shared with the fans. This is exclusive when competitive sports become a battleground when you're trying your best irrespective of condition, because this type of unique experiences exclusively happens when you're trying your best, that push your limit in the midst of mental exhaustion. Therefore, this creates this emotional exchange. So this is exclusive with Stoicism. But second, in comparative, on their side of the house, this unique experience when you're on the edge of mental exhaustion doesn't exist because this type of condition is no longer allowed without Stoicism on their side of the house. This is extremely important because this emotional exchange between like fans and athletes is important because this is what drives athletes to do more, to be more fulfilled by achievement. Because athlete pushing through is not only because of money, it's not only because of paycheck, but also because of the fans supporting them along the way, of because the memory made and shared along the way during their journey as an athlete, as a professional athlete, whatnot. So then therefore this becomes an important thing for athletes to have. So exactly, competitive sports without this rips away athlete avenue to have this meaningful relation with fans. So therefore, this is exactly bad in government. So this is the last thing that you could actually explain in the last area that you could actually explain in this particular motion. But note that other areas could also be possible to talk about minority and whatnot. Feel free to explore that. This is a general idea what you could talk about in this motion from the CAP. So yeah, thank you very much for watching the debrief for round 2. Bye-bye.